Well, welcome to Divergent Language Solutions series on automated translation. So this is our first session of many to come on automated translation, which is to say machine translation and generative AI translation. And that's the whole crux of this, that we're talking about many things under interchangeable terms. So today we're going to go over the basics of automated translations for legal professionals, because without setting the stage here as to what is what, it's both impossible to consult clients adequately on what they need, and it's also impossible for them to understand what fits their needs best. So quickly, a quick introduction from my end. I'm a partner here at Divergent Language Solutions. I've been in the legal language services business for 22 years, working with global law firms and international corporations. And at Divergent, we've been in business since 2012, working predominantly with the legal community on large scale, highly sensitive matters across arbitration, IP, white collar crime, antitrust, and translation done by human, machine translation services, interpreting, transcription, and even managed review. So that's a little bit about me. And to give a different perspective here from the law firm side is my colleague Remu. Remu.
Hi, my name is Remu Ogaki. I'm an attorney at Hilgers PLLC, and I've been working in international and multilingual litigation cases for 16 years. My practice focus is in discovery, with an emphasis on applications of AI and TAR, that is technology-assisted review, for analysis of various forms of electronic evidence. And I particularly work frequently in multilingual cases. So this ties into translation and the linguistic side of things.
Great. No, it's a good fit. We're glad to be doing this today, and think a lot about a lot of information out there about language services and technology. Well, we'll get to that later, but I think it's lacking, and we can certainly do our part to at least bring to the fore a little bit more about what we're seeing behind the scenes. So obviously that gets to why we're here today, why this first session. From our standpoint as a language services provider, I think in every meeting I've attended over the last year, it's almost guaranteed that a question will come up about automated translation. Now, the question about automated translation may be asked in a different way. Maybe, do you use machine translation, or how's it going with AI? But there's a lot of, do we use it? Is it done as a first pass on all of our translation jobs? Will it take over our industry? But it pretty quickly becomes clear that the it, as it were, is undefined. And that's really, we're starting to see a problem. Um, do you see the same on your end, Remu, when you're working with clients?
Yeah, this is definitely true in litigation as well. We are constantly being asked by clients how we can harness AI, or more broadly speaking, technology, particularly in foreign language cases, to reduce costs.
Yeah.
In particular, there are people who will ask us, like, why do we need a bilingual attorney with a higher rate as opposed to simply plugging into an AI all the evidence that we have, translated into English, and simply have a English-speaking attorney look at their evidence. And understanding what the risks and potential pitfalls of that, I think, is something that's a difficult issue.
Yeah. Yeah. There again, just I think the conversations start a few steps too far forward, so to speak. So when I'm asked about AI, again, whether it's phrased in terms of AI or machine translation or automated translation, it quickly becomes obvious that, we need to take a few steps back and provide some background information to our clients, at least, as to, what these technologies are, what's been out there, and where are we now? Because I think without doing that, a lot of people don't actually know, they couldn't specify what it is they're asking for. And without knowing that, they can't obviously adequately find out what is best for them. And so, whether it's legal professionals looking to bring a technology in-house, or they want to start evaluating their language service providers in a different way to see what types of technology those vendors are using, we're increasingly, as a language service provider, which I'll say LSP going forward, we feel it's incumbent upon ourselves to just share more information on the subject, because again, without it, we're kind of starting it's not the right starting point. So I guess I sense you're also in the same boat. Do you feel that clients on your end have a very good general understanding of these technologies, or are most in the same boat where they naturally don't know too much about it?
I would say it's fair to say that many people do not have a very strong understanding of particularly the technology aspect, simply because, I mean, translation and foreign languages generally are a very niche and specialized field. But there may be this general sense of there's technology that can do this, but often without completely understanding like what it is that the technology is good at
Mhm.
versus what it is that it may not be good at, or it may not be as effective at. And understanding the strengths and weaknesses, I think, is something that's really critical on even just understanding the basics of what are the tools that are out there,
So
what can be done, and what can't be done.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And hey, we're very close to getting into that, to just breaking it down. I think the last words there would be from my standpoint, again, as a language service provider. I think it's critical at this juncture. A few years ago, it probably I wouldn't feel the same, but it's necessary to become a bit more vocal about, our work and the processes and the technology on our end that are already in use. Because I think when buyers aren't aware of what goes into a service, they can have a harder time seeing the value of that service. And of course, that risks assumptions being made that, as you say, why can't we just use this or just use that? So, I think it's our responsibility to obviously guide our clients and make sure they're making the best decision. And there are a range of tools out there, but there are a myriad of situations in which they fit and don't fit. So I think, for an educated buying decision, we get into the crux of, again, what we're here for in session one, which is really, what is what. And, I think the best term to use is an umbrella term of automated translation, regardless of what we're talking about. Really, what we're talking about here is automated translation. And when people use that term, they might be using one of many things. I think up until a year or two ago, most people would have been referring to tools like Google Translate, DeepL, things like that, and that would be called machine translation. And now, of course, these days you got generative AI. But if we take a step back, machine translation itself has its entire, its own journey. And I think we could break that up into three categories for the viewers of this session, which is number one, rule based in the 1950s, used a lot of grammar rules and dictionaries, and basically translators, told the machine exactly how to translate one word or structure into another. And it was a slow and brittle process. Translations were robotic, literal. That was the very beginning. Now, statistical was more about patterns, and it learned from very large libraries instead of the grammar rules, and then statistically guessed what the best translation would be. And that did lead to smoother translations, but it struggled with things like idioms and context. And this was the initial iteration of what the market saw for MT in the 80s. And just it struggled with long sentences and complex structures. It didn't understand context very well. And I think you actually had a good story about statistical MT, Remu, correct? So given your language background.
No, I definitely did. I had a case a little bit more than 10 years ago where a law firm that I was working with had asked me to evaluate whether or not MT was suitable for using on a data set of evidence. It was in Japanese, and they were running a statistical MT to machine translate the documents and on a sample set to see if this was something that they would consider using. And I began by looking at the English language translations that the MT had spit out. And I was very confused because it seemed like every single email was beginning with a phrase that said, "Yes, I will marry you." And I was like, what is going on? And I realized what happened was there's a phrase in Japanese called yoroshiku onegai shimasu, which is a very, very difficult term to translate in the sense that it can be translated into a myriad of different things.
Mhm.
Usually in a business context, it would be just a general greeting, just saying, hi, how are you, basically.
Okay.
But it could also be a response to say, yes, I will marry you to a marriage proposal.
Hmm.
And so in a demonstration of how statistical MT struggles with context, it was translating this phrase as a response to a marriage proposal. And that was a good demonstration of how it struggles.
Yeah, stories are the best. And I think in session two, we'll certainly get into more of those once we outline exactly what's what here. And then we get into the actual challenges of the output and the things that you have to deal with on the back end here. All right, so that was statistical. So we had rule-based, we had statistical, and then really the big breakthrough, which is where we've been for quite some time, is neural machine translation. And that, mid 2010s, it was a game changer, and that was artificial neural networks, like tiny connected brain cells in a computer that learn from massive amounts of data and allowed it to understand entire sentences instead of just the word by word reproduction. And it was much more natural sounding. And that's what we've seen in products, at least up until probably a year ago, with Google Translate, DeepL, Amazon, Microsoft Translator, things of that. So there was a strong alignment between the source and the target, and it was really optimized for predictable output. And I think we should mention before we get into the next and final and latest sort of iteration of automated translation is that it was predictable output, unlike what we get into now, which is finally generative AI. And generative AI, and I think this is the biggest point I make when I'm at a meeting, it's simply the latest technological advance of automated translation. So when people ask, is this going to wipe you out, or is the industry going to change completely? It's been changing for a long time, but it's slowly changing if you look at it from 30,000 feet. So this is just the latest iteration, and generative AI does things that neural machine translation doesn't do as well, but there are still things that neural machine translation does better. So, AI obviously learns from patterns in billions of sentences. It improves over time as data is added, just like neural machine translation. Seems to handle context better, it seems so far, for more creative formulation of content. But again, it's at least, and I think, Remu, you're going to go into this a bit, what a lot of us think of in terms of generative AI, like ChatGPT, so on and so forth. It's just translation is one of the many things that it does. But I think you were going to go into breaking down a little bit of the types that are out there right now.
I mean, this is a constantly changing subject, but
Mhm.
generally speaking, you can
Yeah.
break this up into basically two larger sections. Like one, you have general purpose large language models, LLMs, that can do translations, but are built for a more general purpose, like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and other such general LLMs. And some other LLMs are translation focused and were specifically created in order to conduct translations. So, even if you're talking about LLM models, you have to look at which type of model that you're using, what it's for, what it's good at. And in general, as far as the general purpose LLMs, these were initially emergent when they were being created for a general purpose, but people realized that you could have them translate even though they weren't specifically designed to do these.
Mhm.
Instead of learning translation from bilingual sentence pairs alone, these models were learning language broadly across numerous languages at once. However, in terms of the quality of the translation, it tended to be uneven. There wasn't as good consistency, and it was better in some languages, but much more
Yeah.
inconsistent in others. And it could be impressive for something short and simple, but the more complex you got, the more unreliable generally those became.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes me think of just the fact that there are these technologies in parallel. I think, up until now, and I would say probably still now, the majority of language service providers where they provide machine translation support, it's most likely neural machine translation. I would say the majority. But even there, over the last few years, there are certain languages that, for which the output has improved dramatically. while there are still languages out there that are lagging. And then again, you have these LLMs where it might work better from the get-go in those languages that are still difficult neural machine translation. And I think that is what comes to the fore when I have these conversations, which is that, the answers here really depend on what you're looking for. What are you going to look to leverage these technologies for? Is it internal purposes? How much risk are you willing to take? How many human resources do you have to review? And what's your budget and things like that. So there's a lot that goes into it. But I think on the translation focused LLMs, yeah, I think they're generating translations as part of a broader sort of text generation process and relying on contextual reasoning rather than the strict source to target mapping, so to speak. It made them feel more human, but it also introduced some risks. So I often say, it may look good, but it doesn't mean that it is accurate. And I think it's not a hallucination. It just means that it may look polished. It may look as though it reads well in English, but it does not actually mean that it is true to the target text. So, an LLM may correctly translate the idea of a sentence while subtly changing emphasis or legal nuance or, and that's a risk. And that's something that neural machine translation was less likely to do. So I think from what we're seeing so far, LLM translation is maybe better by far right now for conversational, creative, sort of loosely structured content where it's not as important to keep to the text, the source text. And one might ask, well, how is that possible? But there are many instances out there, such as trans creation, marketing text, where you want a lot more liberty. Whereas in the legal world, you need to make sure you have the fidelity to that source text and the consistency and terminology is there, and that there's a predictable, repeatable output. So there's a lot to think about. And I think at the end of the day, and this is certainly what we'll get into in session 2, is that neural machine translation, just like generative AI, isn't perfect. And we need to remember that for generative AI, again, it's the latest iteration of automated translation and it's generative by nature. So it still makes mistakes and it often doesn't know when it's wrong. And that's why, human reviewers are still vital. Any thoughts so far? I feel like I've been talking for a while.
No, I one thing I wanted to really emphasize and add, just from a litigation standpoint,
Hmm.
is there's a one really important key weakness to understand about any form of MT or AI model that exists now, which is that the translation provides one answer
Hmm.
that is based solely on what is most likely to be accurate. This is the reason I say this is because in translation, there's a not uncommon situation where there are multiple correct translations that are nearly equally plausible. Like if you put it into a probability model, like the differences might be like 99.999% versus 99.998%. Like the selection between several different options is almost arbitrary from a statistical standpoint. However, um, the multiple correct translations may include options while are equally accurate. They
Hmm.
may have radically different legal importance, where the meaning
Yeah.
of one translation may have a dramatic effect on the litigation, and the other one may have a dramatic opposite effect or no
Yeah.
effect, where you may be leaving evidence that could be very helpful to you on the table by not knowing that this other possible translation is out there, or having a extremely damaging piece of information go out without you knowing that it's there and handed to the other side in a production.
Yeah.
And so understanding that a translation can have multiple correct translations, and it won't necessarily be the case that the most legally advantageous or disadvantageous translation is going to necessarily be suggested to you by
Hmm.
a machine translation or an LLM is, I think, a risk factor that any litigator has to take into account.
Yeah.
And it would be one of the major strengths of a human translator in the sense that they can warn you when a
Yeah,
document is potentially has multiple meanings and multiple of different levels of significance.
exactly. I know I'm thinking about how, obviously, I suppose with a translation specific LLM, you could prompt it for, multiple variations of the translation. But I think that this is a good point. I would imagine a lot of clients or prospective buyers of language services might realize this is something that happens, but also not have heard it before. That, over the 22 years of doing this, it doesn't happen all the time, but especially when things are critical and you think about all the documents involved in a case and all the context and the supporting documentation, especially in litigation or investigations, all the underlining reference materials. A translator, whether they're doing post editing, but especially when they're translating from scratch, they are sort of prompting themselves all the time for, what is being said here. It, I'm looking at the source and it's the same terms, but in this context, that is what's going on all the time. And the surprising part, maybe for end clients to hear, is that there is quite a bit on the back end for translation agencies when we're working with the translator and the editors and even the proofreaders. We really dig in to understand, is this is inconsistent from that term, but in the Portuguese it was the same term. So, and they always have an answer for why they've used it differently. And obviously, clients know where certain documents are of much greater importance, and they'll dig in to say, could this be translated as such? Or I believe that the author meant this, and that there's a lot that goes into it, and whether it's a post editor or somebody reviewing things internally or just a translator doing the work from scratch. And we'll get into that later. There's a lot of risk there on the table that one has to be aware of. So yeah, it's very helpful. And I think, the conclusion here is that I think now that we've established what's out there, clients, anybody interested in thinking they need these services or they want to see whether these machine translation services or AI is something for them. Again, we'll get into that, but there are so many common myths and assumptions and just things one must consider when you're using any of these technologies. And I think there certainly is a knowledge vacuum. Things are moving so fastly, and people need to understand first what's what. That was the goal of today. And then, does it make sense to use certain technologies? If so, when? There's also, of course, the question of who's best positioned to use it. Should you be, I think in this ever commoditized world of apps and platforms and technology and subscription models, there's a do-it-yourself mentality. Let's bring this in-house. Let's just sign up for a subscription. But there's a lot, obviously, that goes into this that can cause organizations, far greater work and cost money and again, invite risk without basically using these things with a proper manual, whether that's, basically skilled project managers and translators who know the language. So we'll get into that in session 2. I think for now, unless Remu, you have any other thoughts, that wraps it up. I hope that if you've listened, you have a better understanding of what's been out there, what's been used, where we're at right now, and we're in a good position to move to session 2 in a few weeks.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks, Michael.
Great. Thanks for joining, and take it easy.